In this session, we'll be talking about the Puritans. We've already kind of mentioned the Puritans a little bit in our discussion of the European backgrounds and some of the tensions that the Puritans had with English culture, especially the crown. In many respects, the Puritans pushed for furthering the reforms that Protestantism had begun. And in many cases, they came into conflict with a lot of the leadership in the Church of England, largely because the Church of England wasn't wanting to make additional reforms. There was a satisfaction with the way things were within a limited scope. So there were reforms, there were changes between Anglicanism and Catholicism, but there was also a desire to kind of maintain some of the things that had been previously done within Catholicism. So you have this way in which there is some push for reform, but not a complete uh, change from what previously existed in Catholicism. And the Puritans really had problems with that, and largely because they become shaped by a more Calvinist, or sometimes known as Reformed Protestantism, which was much more anti-Catholic and much more interested in seeing greater changes taking place. Certainly, the idea, the notion, the name Puritan comes from an idea of wanting to purify, particularly purifying the Church of England. So, that's kind of the um, impetus here for this group that develops. Puritan, of course, was not a name that they um, specifically chose. It was a name that was given to them by people that were against, uh, their particular positions. As a lot of groups tend to get their names that way from outsiders who are opposed to them. We mentioned in the uh, lecture on European backgrounds that a lot of the coalescing of the Puritan movement came because of um, some things related to the persecution of Protestants by Queen Mary of the House of Tudor. Now, there were some things that were going on prior to Queen Mary that are kind of foundational for Puritanism, but it's really when Mary starts persecuting Protestants. And this group of 300 Protestants uh, travels to Geneva to escape that. All right, we refer to them as Marian exiles, right? They're leaving from the reign of Queen Mary. And as they leave England, go to Geneva in Switzerland, um, they are uh, exposed to the not only the teachings of John Calvin, which they would have gotten in some other places possibly, but more fully in Geneva, but then also seeing how that society worked. That Calvin had been given a lot of leeway at various times to shape Genevan society much like he wanted it to look, in accordance with some of his visions about the Holy Commonwealth. And so as they go to Geneva, they begin to see some of this in practice. And after Mary's death, when Elizabeth comes back to power and those Marian exiles return, they bring with them those ideas that they've adopted in Geneva. But there's still that even though the monarch Elizabeth has become has shifted the country back to Protestantism, there is still a concern that, on the one hand, that the Church of England hasn't reformed enough, and then on the other hand, a concern that the crown the Queen, is much too emphatic about enforcing some things, particularly things like what kind of garments should be worn by those officiating in a service, a priest or a preacher or somebody like that. Um, and so this was something that the Queen and then later monarchs attempted to enforce people to adopt, to conform to the Anglican way of worship. And so that too caused some problems because, again, the Puritans did not believe these things aligned with Scripture. And so there was some tension there between the Puritans and the in the monarchy, which meant that a lot of the experience of Puritanism was largely one of tensions. There were tensions between Puritans and the larger culture. In many respects, as I've already mentioned, there was a concern of Puritans that there was not enough reform that was taking place in the Church of England, and that there needed to be certain things adopted, but certain things discarded. And really, in some ways, this was a very acrimonious relationship between Puritans and the larger English culture. But there were also some tensions between Puritans as well. Not to the point necessarily of open fighting as much as it was with the monarchy, but there were still some differences among Puritans as to, considering there's this disconnect between their reforming vision and the Anglican Church. What do you do about that? Right? If you're because in many respects, the Puritans are a movement developing within the Church of England. And so they face similar kinds of questions that reformers have always faced within Christianity, is how do you relate to that larger church you're trying to see reformed? On the one hand, you had those that were sectarian or separatists that believed that they had fully understood what the church should be like, and that the larger Church of England was wrong, was apostate. And they believed that the way in which they needed to approach the church was to completely separate themselves from it. That they could not, in good conscience, stay within the Church of England. And so they separated from it, having a very sectarian outlook, like we are the ones that have it right and everybody else has it wrong. And so that was one approach within Puritans. And in many respects, this was problematic for the government because separatists could look like insurrectionists. Right? They could look like not only are they causing problems religiously, it could potentially become a problem politically. And so there was a concern with the separatists there. The other group, non-separatists, were more pragmatic. They stayed within the Church of England. They hoped that reform could take place. They believed that this was still possible. And so they looked at what they were doing as not so much separating from the Anglican Church, but providing them an example. That through their approach to Christianity, the larger church would see and would make the appropriate reforms. And so a lot of these people believed that they could make changes, but they believed they should stay within the Church of England. Now, in many respects, the Puritans, on both the separatists and the non-separatists, were not liked by the government and the various monarchs because of, they both of them were pushing the need for changes. And so because of that, both separatists and non-separatists ended up leaving England, not all of them, but many of them leaving England to immigrate to the British colonies. The first group was that one which set up Plymouth Colony in 1620. This is the group that we often refer to as the Pilgrims. These were separatist Puritans who had gotten to the point of leaving England, believing that they could not even stay in England, and kind of escaping some persecution, and so they had traveled to the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, they didn't face so much persecution as they faced a culture that they felt was extremely immoral. And there were a lot of things going on in the Netherlands that they believed they could not be around. And it is that influence that leads them to then go to the British colonies in the Americas. This is the group that, wants to come over on the Mayflower. Now, on the Mayflower, there were 35 separatists, but most of the rest of the travelers were Anglican. So we shouldn't get the idea that it was in the Mayflower it was just separatist Puritans, but there were those that were Anglican as well. And of course, they're heading for Virginia, but they don't end up in Virginia. They end up in what's now Massachusetts. Half of them, of course, died the first winter. Plymouth, attempted to remain separate, and the Plymouth colony remained separate until 1691, when it was absorbed by the larger colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was founded in 1630. So this group was a larger group. They left England in 1629, predominantly made up of non-separatist Puritans. Traveling on the ship the Arbella, they elected a man named John Winthrop to be their governor. And as they got to Massachusetts and prepared to disembark, Winthrop preached a sermon to them, which is a very important sermon. And in it, he referred to the colony of Massachusetts Bay was going to be a city on a hill. Now, the language is from the Gospel of Matthew, from the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus talks about it, you're the light of the world, a city on a hill cannot be hid. So essentially, the way Winthrop is framing this, that was understood by a lot of Puritans at the time, is they are going to be an example to England, right? That essentially God and the Puritans were in a covenant relationship. Right? The notion of covenant, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, the notion of covenant was very important for the Puritans. And so here's this idea of the Puritans, by leaving England, are engaging in a covenant with God, and their safe landing had indicated that God had accepted that covenant. And so the goal here is to create this city, to follow the guidelines of Micah, to do justly, love mercy, to live in peace and harmony, etc. And that while they do so, and they live according to their values and their ideas that they have been trying to express, England is going to see, they're going to recognize the importance and the validity of the Puritan way, and they're going to follow it. Well, you know, that doesn't happen, and we'll talk more about why, some of the reasons why it doesn't happen. But when we think about both the Plymouth colony as well as the Massachusetts Bay colony, we often have this idea of, oh, here are these, English citizens fleeing to the New World for religious freedom. And in some cases, there's some validity to that, in that, the leader of the Anglican Church, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop Laud, Laud was his name. He was very repressive of Puritanism. And so because of that, the Puritans had obtained these royal charters. And what was interesting for Massachusetts Bay is that it was unique compared to some other colonial charters, in that most of the charters had a requirement that the colony, the people running the colony, needed to keep a headquarters in England. The Puritan charter didn't have that, so they didn't need to keep anybody in England. They could all go to Massachusetts Bay. But they didn't allow dissent in Massachusetts Bay. So the kind of persecution they faced in England, they often enacted in Massachusetts Bay, in that people were expected to live the way the Puritans thought they should live, even though a lot of people in Massachusetts Bay weren't Puritans. Eventually, that charter was revoked in 1684, and a royal governor was appointed, and so that shifted some things eventually. There were a couple of things that were important for the Puritans with that society, with that city on the hill. One was this idea of chosenness. The Puritans believed that God had chosen them and that they were in covenant with God. Now, we sometimes refer to covenant, or try to explain covenant in terms of contract, agreement, right? And to some extent, there's some validity to that. There's some ways that's helpful. But the idea of covenant was very, very important to these Puritans, and they had a wide notion of covenant. Right? There was the covenant between individuals and God. Right? That there's this covenant of grace that God had enacted in the gospel dispensation. Now, previously, there were covenants of works, there were covenants of faith that the Puritans believed in, but in the current time period, in the Christian age, there was a covenant of grace, right? That God had provided grace to human beings through Christ. That covenant was accepted by faith. It was a personal covenant, an individual encounter with God. And so God's side was salvation, forgiveness, death of Jesus, grace. The personal side was, the commitment to walk in God's way, to walk humbly, to be dedicated, to be grateful. Right? And because of this, the Puritans believed themselves to be God's chosen people. And in many respects, kind of saw their lives as reenacting the Exodus, so to speak. Right? That they're escaping Pharaoh, who's the king, right? James at the time, and escaping. Well, for Massachusetts Bay, it would have been um, King Charles I. But in escaping persecution, they're crossing the Red Sea, the ocean, to come to the Promised Land. And so it wasn't just about a covenant between individuals, an individual and God. It was a covenant between the collective and God. But then there's also, as they set up these um, churches, these other villages, etc., within Massachusetts Bay, those churches had covenants. Right? The people would covenant together to create a church. And, as we mentioned previously, Puritans were Congregationalists. Right? They believed that the congregation was kind of the sole organization of the church, right? So there's not a hierarchy like there would be, especially a hierarchy of bishops, like there would be within the Anglican Church. And so they're Congregationalists. And it was at the church level that you determined who were the saints. Right? You could discipline or excommunicate members, hire and fire ministers. And only those who were in the covenant could participate in the sacraments, which were predominantly baptism and the Lord's Supper, communion. So you have the individual covenant, you have the covenant for the churches, and then there's kind of the community covenant. We mentioned about the Reformed view, largely shaped by Calvin, but also some others, of the Holy Commonwealth, right? The town or the Commonwealth. Well, that was a community covenant, right? And so you have this idea of creating these communities of saints, these holy commonwealths, where a community is covenanting together to live according to certain principles, which included enforced morality. Right? That not only is it the role of the church to kind of discipline its members, but the belief was that the community, the state, had not only the right but the obligation to enforce in a community morality. That moral offenders are not, those that break morality are not only problematic in the church, but they are threats to civil orders. Right? They're a threat to the community. They're disturbers of the peace, and they need to be punished politically, civilly. And it didn't matter whether you agreed with the Puritans or not. When they were in power, you had to follow their laws, including some Sabbath laws. Now, the Sabbath, of course, we talk about in the context of Judaism and Israelite worship. But for the Puritans, a lot of the notions of the Sabbath had been transferred over to Sunday, the day of worship. And so there were a variety of laws of what you could and couldn't do on Sunday. Things like doing business, watching people engaged in sports. All of those were against some of those Sabbath laws. And so you really had a combination of church and government that it was shaped by this notion of the Holy Commonwealth. And so you have these Calvinists committed to this very literal reading of the Bible. And we talked about the idea of creating a community of visible saints. And that's largely what they're trying to do, is to create a community where the laws of the Bible shape the the laws of the community, and people are expected to be a part of that. Some other things about Puritan life that were important. Let's talk a little bit about family life. Women could not vote. They did receive some legal rights, but did not have a lot of political rights. They were often celebrated as visible saints, or not celebrated, recognized as visible saints. They were more likely to be members of the church, and this was celebrated, right? Because here are these women who were claiming a chosenness that was very important. The domestic center, the domestic was the center of Christian life. Right? The home was very important, so the family was very important. It was a place of religious instruction and guidance. Love, affection, and tenderness were very important in the family home. Of course, more exhibited by women than men. And the family relationship was conceived to be the model of the relationship with God. These were the things that demonstrated what one's personal relationship was supposed to look like. Ministers wrote guidebooks about family life. The importance of domestic order was a frequent theme in sermons, and even showed up in poetry. The importance of a lot of this. When it came to husband-wife relationships, no couple could be married unless their intention had been announced in 3 successive public meetings, or a written notice had been attached to the meeting house door for at least 14 days. So a very formal process. Wedding ceremonies were done by civil officials and not ministers. Essentially, they rejected the Catholic idea of marriage being a sacrament. But they did look at marriage as being a covenant, right? So it still had important religious significance, but it was more of a secular arrangement. Eventually, of course, when the Church of England takes over, they are the ones that take over doing about weddings. Weddings were followed by these grand parties and feastings, and the marriage had to be consummated or it was not valid. In fact, if the husband was impotent, the bride was freed from the marriage contract. Divorce had to be handled by civil magistrates. In England, you could not get a divorce. You got an annulment or a separation. So Henry's divorces, we use the term divorce, they were technically annulments. That's different than what it was like in New England, in Massachusetts Bay. You could divorce if a spouse was already married, if there was what they called criminal uncleanness, if it was incest, if one spouse was discovered to have had premarital sex, that too could have led to a divorce, and if one spouse maliciously deserted another spouse, that could be processed as a divorce. If the divorce was handled in one of those ways, you could be married again, right? And so if your spouse deserted you very maliciously, you could get married again. The courts didn't just sit back and wait for people to have complaints, though. Often they got involved in situations themselves if they deemed something inappropriate was going on. For example, if it was noticed that a man was consorting with a woman who was not his wife too often, right, and he was spending a lot of time with her, the court might step in and forbid contact between the two people. Even if the wife hadn't filed a complaint, the court could still step in. If a husband wasn't supporting his wife properly, the courts might step in. So essentially, the fundamental duties of Puritan marriage were peaceable cohabitation, sexual union and faithfulness, and economic support of the wife. Not only was the husband to economically support the wife, the husband was also to be the one to instruct the wife in religion. Husbands and wives were expected to be moderate in their love toward each other. The love that they had for each other was not to overshadow the love an individual had towards God. Right? So the love you have towards God is supposed to be greater than the love you have towards your spouse. One of the other things that was unusual with husband-wife relationships was that Puritans usually decided to get married first before they had someone they were interested in marrying. Right? So it's like, okay, I'm going to get married now. Who am I getting married to? Right? So you decide to get married first, then you decide, who you're going to marry. The most important factors for a lot of Puritans in who to marry had to do with their social rank. Where did this person rank in society? What class were they in? As well as their church membership. Were they a member of the church? The assumption was any sort of loving relationship would be produced afterwards, right? After the marriage had taken place, or after the decision to marry this person had taken place. When it came to the relationships between parents and children, the main duties parents had were for food, shelter, protection, and education. Education, of course, was very important for the Puritans. Certainly, the emphasis was on educating them spiritually. And so children were taught to read so that they could read Scripture. I mean, certainly, reading was a benefit in other ways, but one of the primary reasons to teach someone to read was so they could read Scripture. Now, coming from this kind of Calvinist foundation, Puritans believed that their children were born evil and ignorant, and part of the way you overturned that was through education. They believed that education prepared children for God's salvation, even though, of course, they also believe in predestination, right? Their child might be predestined to be saved, predestined to be lost, but they believed that education was part of the process that God used to bring about salvation. The education early on was informal and then became more formal as the children grew older. So instruction both secularly and religiously. When it came to secular education in a school, it was about reading and writing, but a lot of the truths that they taught were, religious truths. Discipline was very important. Spanking and whipping were not unheard of, but they were to be a last resort. And many ministers tended to encourage correction occurring through kindness as much as possible. Most girls ended up being housewives, so studying was different for them. Some boys ended up following their father's calling. Others would follow something else. But usually between the ages of 10 to 14, your calling was determined, and you apprenticed for the next 7 years in the house of a master in whatever trade you were following. And so you lived separate from your parents during that time. God wouldn't specifically reveal your calling to you. So you would kind of have to, figure that out, right? Is this calling useful to society? Does it fit in with my talents and inclinations? Basically, though, it often ended up with the parents, particularly fathers, making the determination of what your calling was. And given the amount of time it took to prepare for a career, there was very little switching because of how much longer it would have been. So that gives us some insight into Puritan family life. When it came to church life, there's some similarities because you're thinking of similar types of ideology. And some things we've already kind of highlighted. Early on in the colony, uh, church attendance was mandatory. People were required by the law to be in church. Ministers had a lot of authority, a lot of respect. Despite, the belief in the priesthood of all believers, there was still a lot of authority given to ministers. The meeting house, what we might call a church building, the meeting house was a center of New England towns. Usually it was the only public building in a community. As soon as a town was incorporated, right, as soon as they decided this is going to be a town, they usually began plans to build a meeting house. And the meeting house would be built on some elevated ground, usually about the same amount of distance from the surrounding houses. 220 meeting houses were constructed in the 17th century, 2,000 more in the 18th. And essentially, as some historians said, this kind of proclaimed to everyone that religion was the highest priority. The meeting houses were built with no concern of how they looked. Right? There's no aesthetics here. They're very inelegant. The differences between meeting houses and common houses were location rather than architecture. They tended to be cold, dark inside, pews facing a pulpit or a desk. Some people have derisively referred to the meeting houses as the Lord's barn, right? That they just look like a barn. Very important to the religious life of Puritans was the sermon, which was also very important for Protestantism in general because of the emphasis on Scripture. The Puritans had very high levels of literacy. And even when Puritanism died out, this remained true for New England because of the influence of the importance of reading. And Puritans read their Bibles, but they probably read not much else. Right? Ministers, however, often had libraries filled with all sorts of works, commentaries, concordances, works of theology. The sermon was really the only regular mode of public communication. Other public communication happened infrequently. It was very important, for the sermons to kind of protect society from ungodly forces, and so the minister was important. It was important for the minister to prepare. The ministers were expected to visit, to tutor the youth, to farm their own land because they often have very low salaries, in addition to preaching. Preaching followed a pretty similar format across churches and ministers. Usually it would begin with an examination of a particular scripture and explain what the text was saying. Then it would move to drawing out doctrines and principles related to the text. And then finally, providing application for the text in the lives of the hearers. And that pretty well, followed the same pattern. There were regular sermons, and there were occasional sermons. Occasional sermons were on special occasions. Ministers being called to, speak at various times, at various celebrations or other things. But the regular sermons, Puritans preached usually 2 times on Sunday and often once during the week. They were 1 to 2 hours in length. And it's estimated that there were 5 million Puritan sermons in the colonial period. 5 million sermons, Puritan sermons. That's not other religious groups. And that's for a population that never got bigger than 500,000 people and whose largest city never got larger than 17,000. The average weekly churchgoer, it's estimated, would have heard 7,000 sermons at around 15,000 hours in their life. Often the focus in these sermons was to show people how terrible sin was, show them the answer to sin, Jesus, and then encourage them to live lives of service. And so that was a large focus of the sermons. So by the 1660s, though, a lot of the sermons had changed to focus more on, issues of falling away, belief that there was an increase in increase in heresy, and increased fears of various things that were going on, including the concerns about Native Americans, etc. The Lord's Supper was held periodically. It was not frequent. And usually there was a separation between a regular service and the Lord's Supper. Now, only full members of the church could take communion. And that led to some challenges later on that we'll talk about here in a little bit. They had a communion table rather than an altar, which was used in Catholicism and Anglicanism. And they believed that Christ's presence was there, but it wasn't locked in the bread and wine or transformed like Catholics and others believed about the transformation. Because of the requirement of church membership, very few people actually took communion. All the elected officials were part of it because all the elected officials were expected to be church members. And so they had to be church members in order to be an elected official. But for others, there was just a minority of the community. That's a large part of how the Puritans viewed their ideal community. But that ideal community began to crumble shortly after their arrival. In many respects, we might say, okay, well, why did this dissent, why did people who came to the colonies, who rejected Puritanism, why were the Puritans not able, considering the laws and a variety of other things, why were they not able to create a unified civilization like they wanted to? Well, one thing had to do with the space. There was just so much space. People were spread out. And so, it was hard to police some of the non-Puritan teachings that persisted. Additionally, when someone was discovered that they were teaching heresy or caused some sort of problem, they would be banished, and any followers would be banished, but they would be banished across these very porous borders between Massachusetts Bay and, eventually like Rhode Island. Well, there wasn't much to keep those people from coming back, right? And so sometimes those dissenters that left just came back, or at least their teachings came back. There was also pressure from Congregationalists in England that continued to allow dissent to foster, as well as the belief that some people had that there was continued revelation, right? That there could be a new light revealed that would provide um, teachings, and so some people believed in that, and that became very difficult for Puritan leaders to try and keep it down, to try and stop it. I want to switch now here to talking about some of the more specific challenges that Puritans faced in their society that challenged that ideal community view. One of those was the a variety of wars or conflicts with Native Americans. We get, in many respects, this idea of the first Thanksgiving, the arrangements between the Native Americans and the Pilgrims, and we talk about some of the Native American leaders helping the Pilgrims, etc. But there was some challenges, and it eventually kind of continued. Plymouth, of course, had relied on Massasoit, but that in later generations that broke down. 1637, for example, and what's frequently been referred to as the Pequot War. There was a conflict between Puritans and Native Americans. Essentially, the Puritans attempt to destroy the Pequots. They claimed that they were responsible for a murder. It was actually the Nyaticks that had killed somebody, not the Pequots, but there's an attempt to try and destroy the Pequots. A larger conflict happened between Puritans and Metacom, or as he was known to the Puritans, King Philip. Metacom was the son of Massasoit, and he had developed a tribal confederacy, right? Brought several tribes together, which also had ties to the French, and so there was a concern about that as well. War broke out between them in 1675 between Metacom and the Puritans. Killed hundreds, took a lot of captives. Puritans kind of viewed it as a failure to live up to the covenant, and that's why King Philip was successful for a time, but eventually the Puritans succeeded. In a lot of these Indian wars, Puritans continued the ideology of kind of participating in the Exodus, that this was a reenacting of the Exodus, a restoration of the Exodus, because they talked about, these ideas of, going against these Native Americans as killing the Canaanites, right, or killing the Amalekites. And so this continued view of, we are reenacting the Exodus, and here are these Canaanites that we have to purge the land of, as the Israelites were supposed to. Kind of connected with the conflicts with Native Americans, there was also a variety of captivity narratives that were published. These individuals who were captured by Native Americans, but eventually got their freedom, and then wrote about their experience, talked about what had happened to them, what their lives were like. Often calling people to identify with the captives, right? There's this instability and ambiguity an uneasiness in Puritan life because there's these fears, including, I mean, there's the fears of heresy that we'll talk about here in a minute, but there's also the fears of, of Native Americans coming and destroying your town, taking your people, etc. And so a lot of these captivity narratives, again, take the Bible to kind of shape the narrative. A lot of reference to Scripture, a lot of identification between the captive writing and a person in Scripture. But it does reflect the challenges that Puritans were facing with Native Americans. There were, however, some Native Americans who converted. They were often referred to as praying Indians. These were individuals who had converted to some extent. And so the Puritans essentially tried to convince them to not only accept Jesus, but also then to denounce their Indian ways as witchcraft. Try to get them to reject their ways. And they would live in these praying towns, is what they were called, because not only did they convert to Christianity, but they often, because of that, had to leave their tribes because they were looked at with suspicion from the tribal standpoint as well. So it wasn't just a concern. And then of course, Puritans are concerned about whether they've truly converted, etc. So there's on both sides here some difficulties that Native Americans are facing because of those that had converted. So on the one hand, the ideal community faltered because of relationships, particularly poor relationships between Puritans and Native Americans. Sometimes there were challenges to the ideal community from within that community. I want to talk about two individuals specifically here who reflect this challenge to this ideal community. One of those was a man named Roger Williams. Williams arrived in Massachusetts Bay in 1631. He was a minister. And he comes to Massachusetts Bay, and he is largely against some of the things that Puritans are promoting when it comes to the ideal community, the Holy Commonwealth. Right? And so, he is against laws requiring church attendance. He's against, a lot of these laws that enforce morality. And so he's, looked at as a threat to social order because he's challenging the authorities. He's claiming, right, that the Holy Commonwealth is it leads to violence, and so he's trying to suggest to them that they needed to abandon the idea of the Holy Commonwealth. He is claiming that the Holy Commonwealth is based on misunderstandings of Scripture. That any of the Old Testament guidelines that were being used to make some of these laws, he's saying those are they don't apply. Right? That you're failing to understand the Old Testament in light of Christ. Right? So he's not only challenging the idea of coercion of religious belief, but he's also challenging some of the ideas of the covenant theology itself. He also argued that Native Americans needed to receive fair treatment, believed that they had been treated unfairly by the Puritans, that the land had just been taken from them. because of his efforts, William was banished in 1635, and he sets up Rhode Island. He purchased the land from Native Americans, and he's responsible for helping set it up. The charter for that colony pushed religious freedom, right? So, the opportunity to have religious freedom with your belief. But basically, when people were exiled from Massachusetts Bay, they were sent to Rhode Island. So, that becomes problematic as well. So, Roger Williams was one. He started out as a separatist Puritan. He eventually becomes a Baptist, and ended up as a seeker. That's with a capital S. That was a specific religious group, not just somebody trying to determine, what do I believe? No, there was a group of people known as seekers. Another individual who challenged the Puritan community was a woman named Anne Hutchinson. She was a nurse and a midwife. In 1633, she and her husband followed their minister, John Cotton, to Massachusetts Bay. So they come over to the colonies with him. And Cotton, he had been preaching some things that probably would have caused problems in Massachusetts Bay. Specifically, he spoke of the importance of the union with Christ, experiencing a union with Christ instead of, conforming to the law, instead of, being about following the law exactly. And so Anne Hutchinson especially, kind of latches onto this, and she is very interested in it, and she begins to share some things with people in her home, kind of after hearing the sermons from John Cotton. The problem with this is that the group she is speaking to is a mixed group. It includes both men and women. So there's a concern on the one hand about some of the things Cotton is preaching, although he eventually is kind of cleared of that. But there's also this fact that Anne Hutchinson is teaching men and women in her home. And so there is a concern that she is a threat to the social order. And so she is put on trial. Now, the way, and this is 1637, the way this worked is that because of the way Massachusetts Bay and Puritanism as well set up their commonwealths, people who were judged to be heretical, like Anne Hutchinson, faced not only a religious trial, so to speak, right? I mean, that's essentially what it was a trial, but could face civil trials as well. And that's what Hutchinson faced. She faced both a civil trial and a religious trial. And in the context of this trial, something very strange happens. So the first day of her trial, this is her civil trial, she's before John Winthrop, governor of the colony, and some others, and they're making some accusations that are on the vague side, and Hutchinson is just schooling them. I mean, the trial transcript is available, and so you can Google it and read through it. And she's pressing them on some things they're claiming about her, and she is, really responding very, very well. And so the first day, she's handling it very well. But the second day, she begins to make the claim that God had spoken directly to her. And that changes the entire tenor of the trial. That she's basically saying that that God had spoken to her about these things that she was teaching. Well, even John Cotton denounces her. That she's not even getting support from her minister. Because of this, she is tried. She experiences both a religious and a civil trial, as I mentioned, and she is banished to Rhode Island, not surprisingly. She is referred to as being a woman, quote, unfit for our society. It's really, that's 1638 is when that takes place. She's pregnant when she is banished and miscarries. And Governor Winthrop claimed that the child that was born, when the fetus was born, it was a deformed, monstrous birth. He said her physician had told him that. John Cotton preaches a sermon linking the supposed deformities to Hutchinson's errors. Right, she, because of her errors, this led to her miscarrying and having this quote-unquote deformed baby. She was guilty of consorting with the devil, of antinomianism, which was kind of like a rejection of the law. She would die in 1643 when Indians attacked where she was living, and so she was killed then. So there was the Native American attacks. There were individuals like Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, some others. Those two were just examples of people who were Puritans. There were problems with Quakers. For example, Quakers were a minority, but they were banished. A few were hung because they kept coming back. So there were problems there. So Native Americans, Puritans, and then also some of the challenges came with the Puritan belief in the supernatural. Historians have referred to this as the Puritans being, living in a world of wonders. The supernatural was very, very active in the Puritan world, and so they had a belief that the supernatural, both good and evil, was at work. Puritans dabbled in astrology, magic, alchemy, right, trying to transform elements. Not everybody, certainly, but there were a lot of people that did, and it was a part of most people's lives in New England in the 1600s. As I mentioned, for a lot of people in this early modern period, before we're actually getting into modern society, magic and Christianity were compatible. They were connected. People believed that both God and Satan worked through these kind of hidden, secret, magical ways. And despite the clergy's attempt to get rid of it, they just couldn't. They wanted to get rid of the ideas here um, and but they couldn't get rid of them. That they were just so ingrained in people to look to both of these aspects, both of these religious views, um, to work. Now, again, while they're trying to stamp out the practice of magic, they're also kind of participating in this, in that, they're looking at various things taking place and giving it a divine reading. So, if, for example, if an earthquake takes place, well, that's some sign of God's punishment. A comet could be a warning that God is giving, right? So, things that we consider to be natural occurrences were very ripe with, supernatural connotations. So, even though they're trying to oppose this combination between magic and Christianity, they're feeding into this notion of the supernatural and a variety of other things that are kind of connected with that. But they did also make a distinction between God's miracles, which were fully supernatural, and Satan's wonders, which were not supernatural. They were deceptive. Satan couldn't do miracles in the Puritan mindset. So they looked at it as being, yes, there are these things that take place that look supernatural, but they are not supernatural. They're not miracles. And so they wanted to try and make that distinction, but they believed that things took place. That there were these things that took place that appeared very wondrous. But it was the working of Satan, and one of the clearest ways Satan worked was through witchcraft. Even before the 1400s is what I was going to say, but even before that, witchcraft was a real thing in European culture, and that continued into the 1600s, the 1700s in Europe. As far as the presence in the colonies, we probably think of the Salem witch trials as being the most famous, but there were things prior to that of witchcraft. Essentially, there was a great concern in the 1690s that Satan was trying to overturn the social order. And that's largely what witchcraft was believed to be, that it was a threat to the social order. And so again, there's the religious concerns of witchcraft, but there's the political concerns as well. Now, it's unclear what happened, what started all of this. It's been argued by a lot of different people about a lot of different things. Some people suggested this kind of mass hysteria caused by things that had leached into the drinking water or leached into the grain. People have pointed to the stressors of the instability of the Puritan community because of Native American attacks. Right? And it's just unclear what brought this on. But there were hundreds arrested. 160 people were accused of being witches between February of 1692 and April of 1693. 50 confessed to being witches. And if someone confessed to being a witch, they were usually spared. 19 women and one man, who was a former minister of Salem, were executed. An additional 5 people died in jail. The accusations began with two young girls who lived in the household of Samuel Parris, who was the minister at the time. A 9-year-old girl named Betty and a 12-year-old girl named Abigail. Their friends then began to have similar conditions and erratic behaviors, and a neighbor told Paris's slave, John Indian, to make a witch's cake using some of the girls' urine to identify the witch. Tituba, who was another one of Paris's slaves, was among those that were named as being witches. She confessed to the alliance with the devil and named a variety of others. And so for the next several months, there was a variety of accusations, various people, various people being accused. A lot of the women who were accused were people who had economic independence. And so some people have pointed out, there's some class issues going on. Here are these women being accused. They had inherited their husband's wealth. Some of them had remarried. Some of them are single. But, they are in this unusual situation. Whereas the girls that are accusing them are servants. They're daughters of servants. They are the daughter of the disgruntled minister. They're farmers' daughters. So there might be some class issues going on here. One of the things that led to the end of the witchcraft trials was the use of spectral evidence, which was considered to be legitimate. So a specter was kind of the image of a person who was only visible to the witchcraft victim, right? So a person would see, I see the specter of Goody Nurse, Good Wife Nurse, Nurse being her last name, and she's pinching me. And so even though, here they are in the trial, and the accused is sitting there, and the witness is sitting somewhere else. Oh, her specter is pinching me right now, and the girls would perform like they were being, assaulted right there in the courtroom, and this, of course, led to this great uproar, and a lot of people accepted this as legitimate. It was not supposed to be decisive, but it was. And it continued until the wife of the royal governor was accused, and then he kind of stepped in and ended the witchcraft court. Eventually, the names of those that were condemned and executed were cleared. But you can see how this really led to a lot of disturbance, upset the social order, because Satan was very, very active, it was believed, in Salem, in Massachusetts Bay. Certainly the Salem witch trials were the extreme, but it does reflect this concern for what Satan might do to the society. The last area I want to mention about these kind of threats to the ideal community has to do with Puritanism itself, and some of the challenges that Puritans faced within their ideal community as it progressed to a later generation. By the 1660s, ministers were starting to notice there was a problem because the number of church members were declining. Now, to talk about that, we need to talk a little bit about how Puritans viewed the process of conversion. Now, of course, they believe in human depravity. They practiced infant baptism. So children were baptized soon after they were born. But that wasn't the total process of conversion. At some point later in life, early to mid adulthood, it was believed that people should have an identifiable conversion experience. And essentially the idea was that yes, you're baptized. Baptism does, have something to do with the conversion process. But what about this conversion experience? And a conversion experience was necessary for full church membership. Right? That if you were going to be recognized as a full member of the church, you needed to be able to discuss your individual experience. And usually it was pretty similar. Essentially, I mean, the Puritans kept records of the telling of these conversion experiences, because you had to tell, either you told a minister and the minister related it, or you were expected to, in front of the church, talk about your experience, and then the church voted as to whether or not to accept you. But they were very similar in that it was believed that you would experience this sudden realization of the depth of your sin and how depraved you were. And that would continue to grow. And you would turn to a variety of good works, for example, to attempt to alleviate the guilt you were feeling. But then you would recognize that those good works were ineffective. They just were not making any change. And you would feel even more despair. But then you would begin to recognize God's grace. You would begin to understand God's grace more fully. And then you would feel this burden release. Now, this process it could take years in the Puritan mindset, but it was necessary for acceptance of someone for church membership. And church membership was important because you couldn't vote. You couldn't vote on church members. Right? You couldn't participate in the Lord's Supper, and you couldn't you couldn't get your children baptized. And it became obvious to ministers that this second generation was just not having these conversion experiences. They might be visible saints, right? They might be living a life, but a lot of people were visible saints. And so there began to be a concern of, what do we do about this? And I think that, scholars have pointed out that there had been such a high regard for that first generation and their faithfulness and their piety and their righteousness, that the second generation and then the third generation just, were having problems living up to that. And so some ministers developed what they called the halfway covenant. The halfway covenant was an attempt to address this second and third generation. The second generation was looked upon as being halfway in the covenant because they had been baptized. And so, could that third generation be baptized? And some ministers, though not all, right? There were some that had a problem with the halfway covenant. Some ministers said yes. And this provided a means to keep that second generation connected to the church through the third generation, right? They wanted their children to have a church upbringing, even though they themselves didn't have that conversion experience. Eventually, it becomes extended to unbaptized adults for their children, right? So it becomes even broader than that. Now, not everybody accepted the halfway covenant. There were a lot of people that felt, this was some sort of giving in too much, or that they just didn't believe that this was the right way to approach it, and they didn't believe that that this is a way to address it. But again, it's kind of a crisis response. And so here we have the Puritans. Now, a lot of people would like to make the Puritans kind of the hallmark of American religious history. In the FIA book that we're reading for this semester, I think that he does address some things as to why that's problematic. The Puritans did not think of themselves as Americans; they thought of themselves as English. But what we see here is a way in which Christians are attempting to make sense of their situation in the Americas. And much like the Catholics we talked about in the previous lecture, right? They're trying to make sense of it. They are trying to go in some directions. But here they are the Puritans are bringing their ideas over about this ideal society, which is very important to them. And it falls apart. Falls apart through a variety of factors. But it does reflect, this notion of what does it mean to be a part of the kingdom of God? What is the kingdom of God? And that notion is a very important one that we'll see in other parts of our journey through American Christianity.